Mobile, Alabama hides a secret that legal archives tried to smother for more than a century. 13 people died between 1847 and 1851 in ways that seemed ordinary at first glance. Fever, mishaps, sudden collapse. Nothing unusual except for one impossible detail. An enslaved man named Samuel predicted every single death with eerie precision, often long before they occurred. What officials uncovered in the spring of 1851 wasn't prophecy, wasn't mysticism, and wasn't any divine curse. It was something far more terrifying. A mind so observant, so cold, and so deliberate that it turned careful study into killing and made murder appear like the hand of fate. The truth stayed hidden in county records until investigators unearthed testimonies showing how one man twisted knowledge into the most disturbing kind of weapon. Before we continue with Samuel and the deaths that shook the richest families in Mobile, I need you to do one thing. Subscribe to this channel right now. Hit the notification bell and leave a comment telling me what state or city you're watching from. Trust me, you will want to see what happens next. What makes Samuel's case especially unnerving isn't just how many people died. It's how long he operated while being completely visible, turning his reputation as a dependable household worker into the perfect disguise for a slow, calculated series of eliminations. Mobile in 1847 sat where the Alabama River meets the Bay, a gleaming jewel of Southern trade. Its wharves stacked with cotton bound for Boston, Charleston, and overseas ports. The city fattened itself on commerce, its population expanding beyond 15,000, nearly half of them enslaved laborers. Tall brick homes stood along Government Street, their iron balconies rising above cobblestone walks where merchants haggled and attorneys rushed between offices. The bay's briny smell mixed with cigar smoke drifting from warehouse doors. And each summer, yellow fever thickened the air with dread and burning tar. The Duvalier family owned one of the grandest homes on King's Crescent, a Greek Revival mansion framed by 6 white pillars and gardens stretching toward an alley lined with servant quarters. Henri Duvalier had made his wealth brokering cotton shipments, trusted by wealthy planters for his ties to Eastern traders. His wife, Madeline, came from established Louisiana lineage and managed a home with the discipline of a seasoned officer. They held 21 enslaved people, plantation hands on their acreage upriver, and house servants in town. Samuel arrived at the Duvalier residence in early winter of 1843, purchased at an estate auction in Beaufort. He was 32, tall and wiry, his hands marked with the faint scars of woodworking tools. The auction ledger described him as literate, skilled in herbal remedies and carpentry, calm in disposition. That last trait should have been doubted. Former owners had granted Samuel strange freedoms. A Quaker doctor in Beaufort had taught him to read medical manuals after recognizing his sharp eye for symptoms. Samuel could distinguish fever types by breath pattern and tongue discoloration. He knew which plants purged the stomach, which stilled hearts, which imitated cholera or lung disease. The doctor had intended the knowledge for healing. Samuel chose another path. In the Duvalier household, he served as a general attendant, maintaining the property, performing errands, and giving minor medical assistance when physicians were unavailable. Mobile's doctors were costly and often unreliable. So many families depended on medically trained slaves to manage routine illnesses. Henri Duvalier believed himself modern for letting Samuel study books from his library, never imagining how thoroughly the man devoured those anatomy and botany volumes. Each night, Samuel slept behind the main house among 7 other slaves. Martin, the carriage driver, Rosa, the cook, Elsie and Harriet, the cleaners, and 3 younger men who tended the grounds. They knew Samuel read constantly, that he often traveled alone to the city on errands, that he watched people with a stillness that unsettled even them. But in a world where survival meant silence, no one questioned him. The white families connected to Samuel's world belonged to Mobile's merchant elite. Besides the Duvalier, there were the Chandlers, Nathaniel, who operated lumber mills, and his wife Evelyn, who collected European porcelain. The Prestons controlled major cotton warehouses on Water Street. Their patriarch, Richard Preston was loud, harsh, and infamous for his cruelty. His widowed sister, Clara, had married disastrously young and now relied on her brother's begrudging support and cutting remarks. These families intertwined constantly. At St. Paul's Methodist on Sundays, at ballrooms during winter festivities, at merchant meetings where fortunes depended on freight rates and crop prices. Their enslaved workers moved back and forth among households, carrying messages, escorting owners, and linking these families through a web of shared routines. That web became Samuel's study. What no one realized was that Samuel had spent 4 years in mobile collecting information, schedules, habits, frailties, learning who drank too much, who had fragile hearts, who panicked at the thought of disease, observing which marriages rotted behind elegant doors, which families had shameful secrets, which men could be cornered by fear. He watched, he listened, and he waited, and he gathered. While tending gardens and completing errands, Samuel collected plants. White snakeroot from shaded riverbanks, pokeweed roots, deadly nightshade berries, oleander leaves from manicured yards. He knew foxglove amplified weak pulses, that aconite mimicked sudden strokes, that trace amount of arsenic could be dismissed as tainted well water. Wealthy households never locked medicine chests from their trusted servants. The other enslaved people noticed Samuel's herb. Rachel noticed his habit of collecting plants, but assumed he was preparing remedies. She brought it up once, saying, "You keep an awful lot of herbs drying in your room." But Samuel only smiled and claimed he was studying to better handle doctoring tasks. That was enough for her. Anything that might cut medical expenses and keep their owners from blaming the enslaved for sickness seemed like a blessing. By the spring of 1847, Samuel had everything he needed. He had knowledge, access, and most importantly, he had selected his targets with a level of calculation that made chance irrelevant. These were not random people whose deaths would raise alarm. Instead, he focused on individuals whose passing would appear predictable, even expected. People whose habits made them vulnerable, whose decline would shift influence, open gaps in households, and quietly alter the social hierarchy in ways that could be exploited later. That April burned hotter than usual, unusually humid for early spring. The air felt swollen, and at night the frogs near the marshlands croaked so loudly that residents struggled to sleep. Samuel moved through his duties with the same calm diligence as always, but something in his manner had changed. His eyes lingered a little longer. During supper service, he noted everything: who ate heavily, who drank carelessly, who complained about aches, who favored wine over water. The first death occurred on April 24th, 1847, and at the time, no one questioned it. Nathaniel Chandler collapsed in his study after supper, clutching his chest and struggling to breathe. His wife found him face down on the rug, lips darkening from lack of air. Dr. Kellison arrived quickly, but the man was already gone. The doctor observed the stout frame, the flushed complexion, the man's fondness for tobacco, and declared heart failure, all too common for a 54-year-old merchant who indulged in rich meals. But what made the death memorable wasn't the passing itself. It was something that had happened 3 days before. Samuel had been at the Chandler home, delivering a message about a delayed timber contract. He stood near the back entry when Nathaniel passed by, red-faced and wheezing after climbing the stairs. Samuel watched him with that measured stare of his, then said something to Chandler's cook, Martha, would recall much later. "That man won't last a week." Martha had laughed at the time. "You don't know that. Mr. Chandler is tough as iron." Samuel only shook his head. 3 days, maybe 4. His heart's too tired. You can see it in how his fingers swell, in the beat of his neck. It won't hold. When Nathaniel Chandler died 3 days later, a wave of cold washed through Martha's chest. She told her mistress, who dismissed it as coincidence. Anyone could see he was ill, Evelyn Chandler said. But Martha couldn't shake Samuel's calm certainty. His prediction lodged in her thoughts like a thorn. The second death came 6 weeks later, in early June. Heat had settled over Mobile like a soaked blanket, and yellow fever season loomed. Families with means prepared to flee inland. Clara Preston, the widowed sister of warehouse owner Richard Preston, fell ill on a Wednesday night. First came the stomach cramps, then violent retching that drained her strength. By Friday, she was feverish and delirious. Dr. Kellison suspected cholera, though no other cases existed. He prescribed laudanum and warned the family to expect the worst. Clara died Saturday morning, her body so dehydrated that her skin had turned ashen. The doctor wrote, acute gastrointestinal failure, possible cholera on the death record. This time, Samuel's prediction had been even clearer. 2 weeks earlier, he had delivered paperwork to the Preston residence. Richard Preston was shouting at his sister in the hallway, accusing her of being a burden, consuming his food, bringing him nothing in return. Samuel stood silently nearby, observing her trembling hands, the way she blinked back tears. Later, back at the Duvalier house, he told Elsie that Clara Preston would not survive the summer. There's a sadness eating her from inside, he'd said, and Mr. Preston doesn't feed her proper. A body that weak catches every trouble. 2 weeks, maybe 3, before illness takes her. Elsie remembered those words only when Clara died, and the recollection made her uneasy. The deaths continued through summer and into fall. Each one looked natural. Each one had been predicted by Samuel with unnerving precision. In July, a clerk named James Foster, who worked at the Cotton Exchange, drowned in the bay. He had been drinking heavily, stumbled off a dock at night, and wasn't found until morning. A week earlier, Samuel had remarked to Martin, the carriage driver, that Foster was living on borrowed time, and that a man who drank that much near deep water won't last long. In August, an elderly woman named Mrs. Talley, who lived a few doors from the Duvalier home, passed away quietly in her sleep. Natural causes. She was 75 after all. But Samuel had told Rachel 2 weeks earlier, her heart's tired. She'll fade before September. By autumn, Samuel had predicted 5 deaths, and all 5 had come exactly as he said. The enslaved people at the Duvalier household had begun noticing the pattern, though none dared speak openly about it. Something about his predictions felt dangerous, but finding the right words felt impossible. In October, everything changed. The deaths became more frequent, and Samuel's predictions grew sharper, almost fearless. Word began spreading quietly among the enslaved communities behind Mobile's grand homes. Whispers carried from one kitchen to another, from laundry yards to stable houses. Samuel sees things. One house, servant murmured at the communal well, "He's got the sight." Another answered, while scrubbing clothes against the board. An older woman at the market shook her head as she spoke. "My grandmother had that gift, could sense when death was near." But others weren't convinced. Martin, who had known Samuel longer than anyone else, began watching him more closely. He noticed how Samuel volunteered for certain errands, how he always seemed to know when families were coming and going, when a house would be unattended, when a back door would be left unlatched. He noticed the herbs Samuel gathered, the way he ground them with a mortar and pestle late at night, believing no one could see him. "No man sees the future," Martin murmured to Rosa one evening, "but he sure can make it come true." Rosa froze with her mixing spoon midair. "You're saying what I think you're saying?" Martin didn't answer outright. Instead, he asked, "Ever notice how the folks Samuel predicts dying are always the same ones he's been around? People he served food to, drank with, carried medicine to folk he had reason to be close to." Rosa remembered the herbs, the powders, the tonics Samuel sometimes brought as supposedly kind gestures. The thought rising in her mind was so horrific, she couldn't hold it there for long. Even thinking it felt dangerous. If she was wrong, she condemned an innocent man. If she was right, she was holding knowledge that he'd get her killed. So she did what most enslaved people did when confronted with something deadly and uncertain. She stayed quiet and she watched. The 6th death came in November, and this one cut deeply into the Duvalier circle. Henri Duvalier's business partner, a man named Alden Lawrence, died unexpectedly at age 49. He had always seemed strong, even vigorous, but fell ill with what looked like a fast-moving influenza. Within 3 days, he was gone. The doctor described it as sudden respiratory collapse, possibly a fierce strain of lung fever. Samuel had predicted it 2 weeks earlier, telling Henri Duvalier directly that Lawrence didn't look long for this world and might want to settle his accounts. Henri dismissed it as idle talk. But when Lawrence died, the memory of that conversation returned with a cold twist of dread. What Duvalier never knew was that Samuel had visited Lawrence's home 4 times during those 2 weeks, each visit involving documents from Duvalier's office. Each time, Lawrence had offered Samuel tea or water, and Samuel had always declined politely, though he helped prepare it. Lawrence's personal servant, a man named Jonah, later remembered his master mentioning an odd bitterness in his morning coffee on 2 occasions. Lawrence blamed it on spoiled beans. The 7th death was far worse, because it involved a child. The Whitmore family lived on Government Street in a mansion nearly as grand as the Duvalier. They had 4 children, and the youngest, Sarah Whitmore, age 7, had always been frail. She caught every sickness immobile, and her mother lived in constant worry. In December, Samuel casually said to Madeleine Duvalier, while serving tea, "The Whitmore girl won't live to see spring. She's got weakness deep in her chest. Next fever that sweeps through will take her." Madeleine was horrified. That's a dreadful thing to say about a little girl. Samuel bowed his head. "Only speaking truth, ma'am. I've seen that look before. The body's giving out." Sarah Whitmore caught pneumonia in January 1848 and died after a week of struggling for breath. Her mother was devastated. The doctor said it was tragic, but not unexpected given her condition. But when Madeleine heard the news, she remembered Samuel's prediction, and a coldness slid through her veins. How could he have known? And why did it feel less like warning and more like foreknowledge of something already set in motion? She brought it up to her husband that night. "Henri, something isn't right about Samuel. He predicted too many deaths, and every one of them has happened." Henri poured more brandy and waved away her fears. "He's observant. That Quaker doctor in Beaufort taught him to read bodies. He can recognize illness. It's not witchcraft. It's learning." But even he felt unsettled. He, too, had noticed a change in Samuel. The silent movement to the home, the watchful eyes, the presence that felt like a shadow pretending to serve supper. The 8th death turned whispers into open terror. Richard Preston, the coarse warehouse owner who tormented his sister, died in February 1848. He had been drinking heavily at a gambling den on Water Street, quarreled over a card game, and stormed out in anger. Somewhere along his walk home, he collapsed in an alley. A night watchman found him at sunrise, stiff and cold, his face twisted in agony. The doctor called his stroke, brought on by rage and liquor. But Preston was only 43, and though he drank, he had always been as strong as a bull. Samuel had predicted his death a month earlier, telling Martin, "That man's going to push his luck too far. A temper like that, mixed with drink, one night, the blood in his skull will burst like rotten fruit." Martin had felt sick when he heard the news. The prediction had been too pointed, too confident, and Martin remembered something no one else knew. Samuel had delivered a message to Preston the night before his death. They'd been alone for several minutes in the warehouse office. When Samuel returned to the carriage, Martin noticed something disturbing. Samuel's hand smelled faintly of bitter almonds. That detail haunted him. He had heard stories, poisons with that scent, things that could stop a heart or twist a brain into seizure. But where would Samuel get such a thing? And how could anyone accuse him without proof? Any accusation without evidence would be suicide. By the spring of 1848, Mobile's enslaved population split into 2 groups. Those who believed Samuel had some supernatural gift, and those who feared something far darker. "He's seen 8 deaths," said a seamstress, shaking her head. 8! And he called everyone. That ain't luck. That's sight. Or maybe he bargained with something. Another whispered. Some whispered darker theories, making signs to ward off evil, that Samuel had bartered his soul for forbidden knowledge. But among those who actually lived beside him, shared his quarters, worked shoulder to shoulder with him, a different idea was taking shape. They never dared speak it aloud, but it lingered in the air like smoke. Samuel wasn't predicting deaths. He was orchestrating them. The trouble was proof. In a legal world that barely acknowledged enslaved people as human beings, where their testimony meant nothing unless a white witness confirmed it, what could they do? Go to Henri de Vallier and claim his most trusted servant was killing people based on herbs and suspicions? They'd be punished for stirring trouble, perhaps sold away, perhaps worse. So they watched, and they waited, hoping that someone with real authority would notice the pattern. That someone turned out to be Dr. Alden Kellison, the physician who had signed death certificates for 5 of Samuel's predicted fatalities. Kellison was competent, though burdened with the cynicism of a man who'd seen too many corpses. He drank heavily, but he wasn't entirely blind. And by March of 1848, he had begun noticing something unsettling, a cluster of seemingly natural deaths, all somehow orbiting the de Vallier household. It began when Evelyn Chandler, now widowed and running her late husband's timber business, mentioned during a social call that the de Vallier family servant had predicted her husband's death. She said it casually, almost jokingly, but Kellison's ears sharpened. "What do you mean predicted?" he asked. Said Nathaniel's heart wouldn't last a week. Told our cook. And 3 days later, it didn't. Kellison had a mind that stored stray details the way a magpie hoards bright objects. He remembered other families mentioning similar predictions. The Whitmore child, Clara Preston. He couldn't recall which servant had been involved in each case, but the pattern nagged at him. He began keeping private notes, reviewing past cases, asking discreet questions at dinners and salons. By April, he had identified the common link. Samuel, always predicting, always present during the final days of the deceased. The question now was what to do. To accuse an enslaved man of murder required hard, irrefutable evidence, something a court of law would accept. Kellison had nothing but suspicion and a chilling pattern. Worse, exposing Samuel would also expose Kellison's own failure. 9 deaths under his watch, all misdiagnosed as natural. His reputation would be shattered. So Kellison did what men in his position often did. He tried to catch Samuel in the act. He began attending social events where Samuel served, silently observing him. He watched the man's hands, his movements, the way he poured drinks and plated food. To any ordinary eye, Samuel was simply a skilled servant, quiet and unremarkable. But Kellison saw something else. Samuel was watching him back. It was subtle. A held glance, a faint smile, a moment of stillness when their eyes met across a parlor. Samuel knew he was being scrutinized, and he seemed utterly unbothered, almost entertained. The 9th death arrived in May 1848 and sent shockwaves through Mobile's legal world. Judge Malcolm Finley, who presided over the city circuit court, died at home after a short illness. He was 61, had complained of tightness in his chest for weeks, and finally succumbed to what Kellison described as heart disease. Entirely plausible for a man of his age. Except Samuel had predicted it 5 weeks earlier. He told Henri de Vallier that the judge would never see his daughter's wedding in June. This time, de Vallier noticed. He summoned Samuel into his study the day after the funeral and confronted him. "How did you know?" De Vallier demanded. "How did you know about Judge Finley and the Chandlers and all the others?" Samuel stood perfectly straight, expression unreadable. "I observe things, sir. When you learn to read the signs of illness, you notice patterns others ignore. Judge Finley carried the look of failing heart muscle. Anyone trained could see it." "You're not a doctor," de Vallier snapped. "You're a servant who learned scraps of medicine from a Quaker. That doesn't give you the power to predict death to the exact week." "No, sir," Samuel agreed calmly. but it gives me the gift of seeing death coming long before others dare acknowledge it. There was something in the way he spoke, not insolence, but a quiet, unsettling certainty that did not belong in a slave addressing his master. A kind of challenge hidden beneath polite obedience. Duvalier dismissed him, but the conversation clung to him like a cold hand around his spine. That night, he spoke to Dr. Kellison at the Gentlemen's Club. For the first time, the two men compared notes openly. 9 deaths, 9 predictions, 9 perfect matches. "It can't be possible," Duvalier said, but doubt edged his voice. "Not unless he's making them happen," Kellison replied softly. They stared at one another, the enormity of the accusation settling thickly between them. If Samuel was a murderer, he had been killing citizens of Mobile freely for more than a year, hiding behind illnesses, misdiagnoses, and the assumption that enslaved men were incapable of such precision. "We need proof," Duvalier said at last. "Real proof. If we accuse him and we're wrong, my name is destroyed. And if we accuse him and we're right, we'll have to explain how 9 people died before we noticed anything." They agreed to document Samuel's movements carefully, to observe him at all times, to wait for him to make a single mistake. What they did not know was that Samuel already suspected them and was preparing his boldest act yet. By late spring of 1848, tension gripped the Duvalier estate like storm clouds gathering before lightning. Samuel continued performing his duties with his usual quiet skill, but everyone felt the change. Madeleine Duvalier caught herself staring at him during dinner service, wondering if the fork he handed her was safe to use. Henri locked his medicine cabinet and counted the contents nightly. Dr. Kellison visited more often, forever watching, forever scribbling notes. The enslaved people felt the pressure most of all. They sensed something approaching, something large, dangerous, inevitable. They saw it in the nervous glances exchanged by the white family, in Samuel's deeper silence, in the way the air itself seemed to tighten. Finally, one evening, Rosa broke the silence. That night in the quarters, Rosa finally spoke what everyone had been holding in their throats. "Samuel, they're watching you. Whatever you've been doing, you'd better stop." Samuel continued grinding herbs in his mortar, the soft scrape echoing to the cramped room. He didn't look up. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do," Martin said from the doorway. His voice was tight, hard with fear and anger. "We all know. Maybe we don't say it out loud, but we know the people you predicted dying didn't just die. You helped them get there." Samuel finally raised his head and met Martin's eyes. For several long seconds, he said nothing. The silence stretched so thin it felt like the walls themselves might crack. "You think you understand," Samuel said quietly, "but you don't know what it's like to watch the people who own you play God. To see them ruin lives without a second thought. To watch them eat until they ache while others go hungry. To hear them preach kindness in church and then whip a man bloody because he dropped a plate." "So you killed them," Rosa whispered, her voice trembling. "You decided who deserved to die." "I decided," Samuel said, and the calmness in his voice was more terrible than rage, "that if I'm forced to be property, forced to serve them, wash their clothes, fetch their food, hear their secrets, then I might as well be useful in my own way. Every person I nudged toward death was someone who made this world worse just by breathing." "That ain't your choice," Martin said, but there was no conviction behind his words. Because the truth was, everyone in that cramped room had imagined such deaths before. Samuel had done what others only fantasized. "It's not about choice," Samuel replied. "It's about opportunity. They gave me access. They trusted me. They taught me medicine for their own benefit, never imagining I might use it differently." He paused. That was a mistake. Elisa's voice was barely a whisper. "And now that they suspect you, what happens next?" Samuel smiled, and it was the most frightening thing any of them had ever seen. Not because it was angry, but because it was genuinely amused. "Now," Samuel said softly, "I give them exactly what they expect." The 10th death occurred 2 weeks later, and it changed everything. Dr. Alden Kellison himself fell violently ill one Tuesday morning in early June. It began with dizziness, then waves of nausea so strong he could barely stand. By Wednesday, he was bedridden, racked with vomiting, fever, and weakness. His wife summoned a physician from Montgomery, but by Thursday, Kellison's kidneys were failing. He died late Friday afternoon. With his last fading moments of clarity, he managed to choke out to his colleague, "Check. Samuel Duvalier's slave? Poison. But the words came out slurred, incoherent. The dying ramblings of a delirious man. The Montgomery doctor nodded sympathetically, but recorded acute renal failure. Possible arsenic exposure as a preliminary note. There was no evidence of how or where the poisoning occurred. The most damning piece wasn't even the symptoms. It was the timing. Samuel had predicted Kellison's death 3 weeks earlier, remarking casually to Madeleine Duvalier, "Dr. Kellison isn't looking well these days. Liquor's worn down his insides. Wouldn't surprise me if his kidneys give out before summer." When Kellison actually died of kidney failure, panic tore through Mobile's wealthy elite. Henri Duvalier went straight to the sheriff, bringing everything: the predictions, the timing, the pattern. Sheriff James Cartwright, a practical man hardened by years of grim cases, listened with growing unease. "You're telling me your servant has killed 10 people in a year," Cartwright said slowly, "and you're only now bringing this to me?" "I didn't know," Duvalier insisted. "None of us did. The deaths look natural. It's only when you put them together that you see the truth." Cartwright tapped his fingers on the desk. "Patterns don't hang a man. We need proof. Witnesses. Poison found in his hands. Something real. Otherwise, you're asking me to execute someone based on coincidence." "Dr. Kellison suspected him," Duvalier said. "He was investigating before he died. Which makes it awful convenient, don't you think?" Cartwright replied dryly. "The man looking into the murders gets taken out. Either the worst luck I've ever seen or the boldest killer I've ever heard of." They agreed on a full search of Samuel's quarters that evening. Cartwright, Duvalier, and 2 deputies entered a small room behind the main house just after sunset. What they uncovered froze their blood. Under the loose floorboards beneath Samuel's bed lay jars of dried plants: aconite, snakeroot, deathbell, oleander, along with paper-wrapped powders, tinctures, and extracts, and a small ledger. A ledger filled with names, dates, and coded notes written in a precise, educated hand. Nothing like what they expected from a slave. Just when it seemed the horror in Mobile had peaked, the truth was about to grow even darker. If this story has you hooked, share this video with someone who loves chilling historical mysteries. Hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Because what investigators found inside Samuel's ledger was more disturbing than all the poisons combined. The ledger told a story of planning that stretched back nearly 4 full years, all the way to the month Samuel first arrived in Mobile. The opening pages were only observations, notes about families, habits, illnesses, weaknesses, NC, chest pain, heavy drinking, breathless after stares, CP, underfed, mistreated, frequent stomach sickness, RP, violent temper, drinks nightly, walks home alone. The middle pages revealed the strategy. NC, foxglove tincture and evening whiskey, gradual dose over 3 weeks, mimics natural heart failure. CP, snakeroot and milk, symptoms mirror cholera. RP, aconite and wine, rapid effect resembles stroke or seizure. The final pages were worst of all. Predictions, written weeks or months before each death, with blank spaces left for the actual dates, later filled in with chilling accuracy. And then came the last entry, the one that made Sheriff Cartwright's hands tremble as he read by lamplight. AK, arsenic compound, slow dosing over 2 weeks. Renal collapse, death week of June 10th. Final barrier removed. Below that, 2 more names were written. More entries remained beneath the final lines. HD pending. MD pending. Henri Devalier felt ice crawl through his chest as he recognized the initials, his own and his wife's. "He planned to kill us," Devalier whispered. "Me and Madeline. We were next." Samuel was arrested that night without so much as a raised voice. In fact, he appeared to be waiting for them, seated neatly on his bed, fully dressed, hands folded, eyes calm when the sheriff and deputies burst into the room with lanterns and pistols drawn. He didn't resist, didn't plead, didn't even look surprised. "Where's the poison you meant to use on Mr. and Mrs. Devalier?" Sheriff Cartwright demanded. Samuel only smiled. "It's already in the house," he said quietly. "You'll never find it." For the next 3 days, they tore the Devalier residence apart. Every cupboard, every medicine drawer, every pantry shelf, every tea tin, sugar jar, spice canister, anything Samuel might have touched. They found nothing, not a trace. Either he was bluffing, or he had hidden it so well it would surface only when it was far too late. Henri Devalier refused to eat or drink anything prepared in his own home for 2 full weeks. He lived on meals from trusted restaurants, sealed deliveries, food prepared in front of his eyes. Madeline's anxiety grew so severe she flinched whenever a tea tray entered the room. They hired tasters, posted guards, locked doors, and still felt death lurking somewhere inside the walls of their mansion. Samuel's trial began on June 30th, 1848, in the same courthouse where Judge Finley had once presided. The gallery overflowed with spectators, the wealthy whose relatives had died, curious townspeople hungry for spectacle, and enslaved individuals watching silently from the segregated benches, their expressions carefully blank. The prosecution built its case around 3 pillars: the ledger, the poisons, and the testimonies of the enslaved working in the Devalier household. Rosa testified about the herbs Samuel collected. Martin described the bitter almond smell on Samuel's hands before Richard Preston's sudden stroke. Elise recounted the predictions, each one striking true with impossible precision. But the most damning statement came from Jonah, the enslaved servant who worked in Alden Lawrence's home. He admitted under oath that Samuel had prepared Lawrence's coffee twice, and on those mornings Lawrence complained of an unusual bitterness. Jonah said nothing at the time, terrified and convinced no one would believe him anyway. The defense, a young, nervous attorney named Stephen Hallbrook, appointed by the court, argued the evidence was circumstantial. Samuel was trained in herbs and medicine. Of course he kept plants. Predictions, Hallbrook argued, could be explained by medical observation. The ledger, he said, could be interpreted as diagnostic notes. Where's the witness who saw him administer poison? Hallbrook asked. Where's a vial, a bottle, a dose linking these substances directly to any death? We have theory and suspicion, but not the proof required for a hanging. On the 3rd day of the trial, Samuel himself was called to the stand. A rare and controversial move, but the prosecution insisted on it. They wanted a confession. The prosecutor, Wallace Breenridge, approached with the ledger raised like a weapon. "Did you write this?" he asked. "Yes," Samuel replied calmly. "And these entries? NC, foxglove tincture, CP, snake root and milk, RP, aconite and wine. What do they mean?" Samuel looked straight at the jury. When he spoke, his voice was composed, articulate, shocking many who expected broken English. "They mean exactly what you think," Samuel said. "I studied each person. I identified their weaknesses, and I used that knowledge to remove them." A loud murmur rippled through the room. Hallbrook leapt to object, but Samuel continued unfazed. Nathaniel Chandler worked men into the ground and laughed when they collapsed. Clara Preston endured years of her brother's cruelty while the town looked away. Richard Preston beat enslaved people to death and suffered no punishment. Judge Finley sent desperate men to hang and let wealthy criminals dine beside him. Dr. Kellison discovered too much, so he became a liability. And the others? Breenridge demanded. James Foster? Mrs. Talley? The Whitmore child? Samuel's expression shifted for the first time. something like the faintest shadow of regret. Foster saw me near the warehouse the night Preston confronted me. Mrs. Talley, she was kind but too observant. She noticed my herb gathering, and she asked questions. The Whitmore girl. He paused, and the courtroom went silent. That was my only miscalculation. I meant to weaken her father. He was planning to flee town with debts owed to Mr. Duvalier. The dosage was meant for an adult. I regret that error. The gallery exploded into chaos. People screamed, sobbed, shouted. The judge's gavel thundered but barely made a dent in the uproar. In the crowd, Amelia Whitmore had to be restrained by her husband as she shrieked curses at Samuel, tears streaming down her face. Once order returned, Greenridge asked a question that had been hovering in every heart. Why? Why did you do this? Samuel's answer chilled the room more than any outburst could have. Because I could, he said plainly. You people gave me knowledge and never imagined I'd turn it on you. You trusted me to prepare your food, your medicines, to walk through your homes unseen. You spoke your secrets where I could hear every one of them. You treated me as an object, then were astonished when I behaved without humanity. He leaned toward the jury, eyes unblinking. I was invisible to you. I moved through your world like a piece of furniture. You spoke cruelties in front of me you would never say in front of your equals. That is power, the power of being underestimated. So this was revenge? Greenridge asked softly. No, Samuel replied. Revenge is emotional. This was practical. I removed those whose absence benefited my position, erased threats, and eliminated people whose existence made the world undeniably worse. It was systematic, calculated, and it would have continued indefinitely if Dr. Kellison hadn't been more perceptive than the rest. The final question hovered, the one no one dared ask aloud, about the two remaining names in the ledger. The two remaining names in the ledger, the final targets, Henri and Madeleine Duvalier, hung in the air like poison itself. Did you actually poison the Duvalier family? Greenridge demanded. Or was that entry in your ledger only preparation? Samuel smiled, the same quiet, chilling smile that would haunt Henri Duvalier for the rest of his life. Does it matter? He said softly. Fear works just as well as poison. Maybe better. For the rest of your lives, you'll wonder. Every cup of tea, every plate of food, every time you feel the slightest ache, you'll whisper to yourselves, is this the one? If something I placed in your home years ago is finally surfacing, that is its own kind of death, just slower. The jury deliberated for less than an hour before returning a guilty verdict on every count. Samuel was sentenced to death by hanging in 2 weeks. The execution took place on July 28, 1848, in the courtyard behind the mobile courthouse. Nearly 300 people gathered. Wealthy families mourning relatives, curious citizens hungry for spectacle, enslaved onlookers standing silently along the edges. The atmosphere was unsettling, neither celebratory nor mournful. It felt like relief struggling against dread, as if killing Samuel wasn't enough to erase the shadow he had cast. Samuel walked to the gallows without hesitation. He refused a minister, refused final blessings, refused apology. When asked for last words, he looked out at the crowd and spoke words that witnesses would repeat and argue about for decades. You build a system that calls people property, he said, and then you're shocked when property chooses to bite back. There will be others like me. Maybe not today, maybe not next year, but eventually, because you can shackle a body, but not a mind. You only pretend you can until one of us reminds you otherwise. The trapdoor fell, and Samuel dropped. His neck broke instantly, a clean, efficient execution. But what stayed with those who saw it wasn't the death itself. It was Samuel's final expression. No fear, no repentance, only a grim, final satisfaction. In the days following his execution, Mobile's wealthy families were consumed by paranoia. Despite Samuel being dead, Henri and Madeleine Duvalier refused to return to normal life. They ate only food prepared outside their home. They boiled their drinking water. They dismissed half their staff. Within 2 years, they sold a grand house on Kings Crescent and moved to Virginia, unable to shake the belief that something Samuel had hidden still lingered inside their home, waiting. The enslaved community had far more complex reactions. Some saw Samuel as a reckless killer. Others saw him as something closer to a symbol. Not a hero, but proof that the enslaved were not powerless, that the system that crushed them was not invincible. They never spoke openly. They couldn't. But the story of Samuel traveled through whispered conversations, coded phrases, and quiet retellings late at night. It became part of the hidden history passed between quarters and cabins. Dangerous knowledge, but knowledge nonetheless. Sheriff Cartwright ordered autopsies on several of Samuel's suspected victims, digging up graves to test for poison. The results were inconclusive. Arsenic and plant toxins decay over time, and medical testing in 1848 was primitive. 2 bodies showed elevated compounds, but nothing definitive. This lack of certainty became Samuel's final cruelty. For years afterward, every sudden illness in Mobile was met with suspicion. Had the person truly died of fever? Or had Samuel left one last dose behind? Had he poisoned the Duvalier? Or merely terrified them into believing he had? The ambiguity gnawed at people endlessly. Samuel's ledger became a morbid treasure for scholars. Lawyers examined it, fascinated by the careful handwriting, the intelligence behind each line, the cold, systematic logic of the annotations. It shattered the comfortable lie that enslaved people were incapable of complex thought. It showed a mind that had outsmarted doctors, judges, merchants. The entire structure meant to keep him powerless. Dr. Kellison's successor, a young physician named Dr. Elias Warren, studied the case closely. He published a medical paper about the challenges of detecting botanical poisons, using Samuel's methods as examples. The article sparked controversy. Some physicians accused him of providing future poisoners with a guidebook, but the work improved early toxicology practice and pushed for better record-keeping of suspicious deaths. The other enslaved people from the Duvalier household were interrogated repeatedly, but never charged. Authorities accepted their testimonies. They had been suspicious, but terrified. Within months, Rachel, Martin, Elise, and the others were sold to new owners across Alabama and neighboring states. None ever spoke publicly about Samuel again, but family histories handed down through generations suggest they carried complicated feelings about him. Anger, fear, understanding, grief, all tangled together. The white families who lost loved ones found themselves confronting an uncomfortable truth. To admit their relatives were murdered meant admitting they had been fooled by someone they considered inferior. It meant acknowledging cracks in the system they believed was airtight, a system giving them absolute power over others. Some chose denial, insisting the deaths were natural. It was easier than accepting the truth. The Duvalier house on Kings Crescent remained empty for 3 years before being sold to a Mississippi family unaware of the home's past. Even they felt something wrong. The wife insisted she sensed dread in the kitchen. They hired new servants rather than employing any who had worked under the Duvalier. They stayed only 5 years before leaving. Mobile changed subtly after the case. Families became stricter about which enslaved workers handled food. Some forbade enslaved literacy altogether. Fearing knowledge created danger. Others insisted literacy and better treatment would prevent resentment. Neither approach solved the injustice that had fueled Samuel's actions. During Reconstruction, when formerly enslaved people began sharing their histories, Samuel's story resurfaced. Elderly witnesses who had known him described a man both brilliant and frightening. Not a symbol of liberation, not a hero, but proof that one mind, pushed far enough, could shake an entire system. Their testimonies emphasized an important truth most enslaved people had: oppose his methods, believing his killings would bring harsh punishment onto the entire enslaved community. But even those who condemned him admitted they understood his fury, even if they couldn't justify his choices. Modern historians examining the case point to several unsettling truths. First, Samuel was almost certainly honest about the cruelty of many of his victims. Surviving documents, court filings, letters, estate papers, confirmed that most of the people he targeted had well-recorded histories of violence, corruption, or abuse. Second, his official count of 10 murders may underestimate the truth. Several other unexplained deaths occurred in Mobile during the same years. And while Samuel never claimed responsibility for more, some researchers suspect he may have orchestrated additional deaths that were never traced back to him. Perhaps the most disturbing, lingering question revolves around the Duvalier family. Henri Duvalier died in 1856 of a lingering illness doctors struggled to diagnose. His symptoms, gradual weakness, organ deterioration, align closely with certain slow-acting poisons. Madeleine lived until 1872, but spent much of her life plagued by strange ailments no physician could cure her. Whether Samuel truly poisoned them or whether paranoia and stress eroded their health remains one of the great uncertainties of the case. The courthouse where Samuel was tried still stands in Mobile, now a museum. His ledger is preserved behind glass, its pages yellow but starkly readable. Visitors describe feeling unsettled not by gore, but by the clinical handwriting, the methodical structure, the absence of remorse. It serves as a stark reminder that intelligence is not inherently moral. Knowledge can heal or be twisted into a weapon, and oppressive systems create pressures that can erupt in catastrophic ways. The story of Samuel and his 12 predictions, 10 confirmed deaths, and 2 forever unresolved, became a cautionary tale retold differently depending on the audience. To some, it warned of the danger of educating enslaved people. To others, it exposed the inevitable consequences of dehumanization. And to some historians, it is simply the case of an extraordinarily intelligent man who turned monstrous under extraordinary pressures. But the true horror of Samuel's story lies not in the murders themselves. It lies in how effortlessly he operated, how perfectly he exploited the blind spots of the very system meant to control him. He moved through Mobile's most powerful households as invisible death, unnoticed until the moment he wanted to be seen. Perhaps the last word belongs to Samuel himself. When attorney Stephen Hallberg visited him the night before the execution, he asked a single question: "Do you regret any of it?" Samuel thought quietly before answering. "I regret the child," he said. "That was careless. But the others, no. They made me through how they treated people. I was only the consequence they refused to imagine." Whether you see Samuel as a murderer, a victim turned monster, or something far more complex, his story remains one of the most disturbing chapters in Mobile's history, not because of supernatural evil, but because every part of it is painfully, brutally human. This case reminds us that the most frightening monsters are not mythical creatures. They are the ones created by cruelty, the ones society refuses to see until it's too late. What do you think about this story? Do you believe the full truth ever came out? Could there have been victims we never knew about? Leave your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this tale and want more historical mysteries guaranteed to haunt you, make sure to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this story with someone who loves the dark corners of America's past. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next video.